Speaking of old hardware, um, I actually have this old desktop computer as well, and yeah, this one is really dusty. Take a look at the graphics card. It's extremely dusty, and that's because I don't use it. Uh, this is basically, I think, the second computer that I built myself. And the first one was a Pentium 3 computer, or Pentium 3 processor. And this is a Pentium 4. And I think it's called the Northwood architecture. And the first Pentium 4 was a Willamette, I think it's called. And this Northwood was the sort of update version of the Pentium 4. And yeah, I don't use it because, yeah, it's old. It's a 3.6 gigahertz processor. It's a single core version, but it has hyper-threading. So in Windows it shows up as 2 logical cores. And yeah, this computer only has, you don't really see it that well perhaps, but underneath the graphics card here, there are only PCI slots, not PCI Express. PCI Express came a couple of years later, and but there's a thing for the graphics card, a port called AGP, which stands for Accelerated Graphics Port, and that port is actually dedicated for graphics card. You can't run anything else on it. And there are different versions of the AGP port as well, like PCI Express. It's like 4x and 8x. That has to do with the speed of it all. And I think there's a AGP Pro port as well, which is a little bit wider, and it can handle a little bit more power as well. And yeah, it's Pentium 4, 3 GHz, 3.6 GHz. It's Asus motherboard. And this is the time when actually the memory controller was separate from the CPU. In today's processors, the memory controller and stuff like that are actually built into the processor. But this time you had a so-called north bridge over here underneath this cooler, and then there's a south bridge, and it's underneath graphics card here. So yeah, the placement sort of described, that's sort of north of the south bridge. So and the north bridge basically handles the communication between the memory and the CPU. That's kind of its main job. The south bridge handles the PCI ports and the graphics ports, and also the storage ports. And this has only 2 SATA ports, and it's the first generation SATA ports, SATA 1, or it's 150 megabytes per second. And then it has a bunch of IDE connections, you know, these big chunky connectors. And it has 2 channels of those, so you can have 4 IDE drives and 2 SATA drives. That's kind of what I have. I have 1 SATA drive for Windows XP, and then these 2 IDE drives are IDE drives, and I run them in software RAID in Windows XP. And the SATA drive is like 160 gigabyte SATA 1 drive, and the IDE drives are 80 gigabytes each, so it's 160 in the RAID 0. But it's still slow, I can tell you that, because the IDE drives, I think the transfer rate is almost like a USB 2 drive. It's like 30 or 40 megs per second. And that's why I run them in RAID, so I get a little bit more speed. This motherboard also has a gigabit network card built in on the motherboard, but the transfer speed are still slow because of the hard drives. I get the maximum maybe 40 megs per second transfer rate, and between my regular desktop and my notebook I get about 90 megabytes per second. So yeah, everything is so slow. And the graphics card, it's a one slot card, and that's pretty unusual today, because with the modern graphics card they always use at least two slots. But this one is before AMD actually bought ATI, so this is actually an ATI card. It's still called a Radeon, but it's Radeon X800, I think it's called. And there's a more powerful one called X850, but this is the 800 card. And I modified it a little bit, so I got a better cooler for it because it got really hot. Because ATI and AMD cards are kind of famous for being hot. So it's a copper cooler, and I also put some coolers on the memory. So yeah, and this is the bracket for the cooler because it's kind of heavy. I still use the standard CPU cooler, and it makes a lot of noise back in those days because it has to run really fast, because these Pentium 4 processors are kind of famous for being really hot and also consume a lot of power. And that's kind of why I don't really use this computer, because the sort of uh, the ratio between the CPU power and the power it consumes is not that great. This computer in this sort of setup consumes about 150 watts from the wall outlet. And if you compare that to my modern computer, that is a Q6600, the quad-core CPU with a better graphics card, a GTX 660, and 3 hard drives, mechanical hard drives, and the sound card and whatnot. That computer actually consumes just underneath 100 watts. So even if it's the new CPU is 2.4 gigahertz, but it's a quad core, and this is 3.6 gigahertz. So yeah, so that's kind of why it consumes a lot more power. But the modern processors, they consume even more, or those computers, and they will consume at least, what is it, 300, 400 watts from the wall, because of the graphics cards. The new graphics cards are kind of power hungry. So yeah, and I don't really know what to do with this computer, because, as I said, it consumes a lot of power and it's very noisy as well. Because back in the day, the fans here, I don't have any fans right now, but it's 80 millimeter fans, both here in the back and in the front here. And they also have to spin kind of fast, and they make a lot of noise. The modern computer cases have at least a 120 millimeter fan back and front, and usually on the top as well, but this doesn't have anything at the top. And the power supply is usually, you had them up here back in the day. Today you usually have them at the bottom. So yeah, I don't know what to do with this computer. It has 2 gigabytes of RAM. It's I think it's DDR1 RAM, and you can't really do much with the 2 gigs. And I actually used to have this computer as a sort of a media computer listening to audio because I have an old Audio 2 ZS sound card that only worked in Windows XP. So, but I thought it was kind of unnecessary to have a dedicated desktop computer just to listen to audio. So I actually managed to put that sound card in my new computer, and the new drivers actually works really well for that card. So now this computer is collecting dust, and yeah, so you tell me, what can I do with it? Because I'm not going to run it 24/7. My electrical bill will go to the roof. And yeah, and it's so old. You might say that I can run Linux on it, but yeah, the problem is that I can't run the latest version of Linux because this processor is not even 64-bit. It's 32-bit only. And there's a thing called PAE, which stands for Physical Address Extension or something like that. And some of the latest Linux distributions need to have PAE activated, so I can't even install the latest version of Linux on it. So the version of, for example, Ubuntu, I can run like 11.04, I think. But that is like 4 years old. So even for Linux, that is kind of old. So no, I'm not going to run Linux on it. Might have some Linux server, but I don't know, just to learn a little bit about Linux. And a couple of days ago, there were all over the kind of tech news that Linux Mint, their website got hacked, and they replaced some of the ISO files for Linux Mint, and they actually had some extra backdoors in those ISO files. So when you install Linux Mint, it had a lot of backdoors open for the hackers to just do stuff. So yeah, it's not only Windows. People say Linux are so safe, but no, it's not. Especially when the hackers sort of pre-install the backdoors, so to speak, before you even install it on the computer. So yeah, so the computer with the Linux Mint, if you downloaded the ISO file lately, you will get, it will be a backdoor included in the installation. So I suggest you don't run Linux Mint for now, or you wait a while until they sort of replace the ISO files. So yeah, I don't know what to do with this computer. I can't really sell it either because it's so old that I won't get any money for it. I might get like $10 perhaps. Not even that. $15, $20 perhaps maximum. And that's the entire computer. So and I don't think anyone wants this either because it can't run really the latest versions of the different operating systems. So yeah, talking about all the hardware, and I am a poor man, so I can't afford to buy new stuff all the time. I don't have a job when I'm recording this video, so I am on social benefits, so I barely have food on the table. That's how bad it is here in Sweden. So I can't really buy new stuff unless people donate things to me. And I repaired computers for people, and I got some old hardware as well from them. I got the old notebooks and stuff, but they are so old that I can't use them, so I basically give them away as well. So yeah, that's kind of an old computer that I have, and I used to have to run an old Minecraft server on this one, and it actually worked pretty good. But as soon as you started to be like 10 people on the server, it started to lag a bit because of the hard drives and the CPU and the memory, especially since I only got 2 gigs of memory. Windows need at least 1 gig, so the Minecraft server got like 1 gig of memory, so that's why I started to lag. So yeah, long video about that. So see you later.